Make it. Very good. Well, welcome all to the next panel for on the decline in. Can you hear me all? Okay, on the decline in corporate research. Let me describe this panel a little bit and the way we're going to proceed. Okay, this panel is going to speak about the issues at hand from a private sector perspective, an industrial perspective. Not all the panelists are from industry, but certainly can reflect that view. And the panel purposely is broken up between what you might call the established large firm players in the world of R&D. And we will start with those three panelists. So we're going to flip a little bit from what's in the program. Then we will move to a couple of really just terribly important domains of frontier technology. And so we'll be hearing from about gene editing, CRISPR, as well as artificial intelligence, particularly as applied to unmanned vehicles, and in that particular setting, not just unmanned vehicles with tires, but indeed unmanned aviation. But with that, so that's going to be the setup, and we are going to divide the Q&A into two parts. We'll first have questions and answers discussion after we've heard about DuPont, IBM, and pharma broadly, and then we will have Q&A, then proceed to the frontier technology segment of the panel. So that's how this is organized. So with that, we will lead off the discussion with Stephen Freilich. Stephen recently retired from DuPont after over 30 years there in both the business side, but particularly the research side. And for the last 12 years of his career, he was director of material science in DuPont Central R&D. So with that, Stephen, it's our pleasure to welcome you. Thank you.
I think it's fair to say that there is no field of science that is more greatly connected to the evolution of human society than material science. In fact, the ages of mankind are known by the materials that were dominant in that period. And so I thought it would be useful to actually start at the beginning and talk about how we got to where we are by understanding a little bit about what started, where we began. So let's start at the Stone Age. Now, when you think about, I only have 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, 10 minutes for all speakers. Yeah.
Starting
with the Stone Age.
When you think about what humans did at the time, they selected a material, they did very minimal processing, and they had basic functionality coming out of it. And as they learned more, they moved into the metals ages, where not only were they selecting materials and processing them, they were also beginning to formulate them so that you could get more advanced, more complex materials, but also more advanced, more complex functionality. But one of the things that you notice in these carefully selected examples is that hundreds of thousands of years later, the same applications are being used, but now with more complex materials. And in fact, this dynamic has maintained through material science even to this day, where new complex materials are replacing older materials. And this has significant implications on how money gets made in the material science world. There are essentially two ways of making money. The first is to substitute the old with the new at a lower cost. So same functionality, lower cost. And that cost is thought about going through the system or the value chain, not at the transactional customer. The other way is to provide a material that does something better that replaces the old, but you do it at the same cost. And of course, you can do both of these if you really get lucky. So in the lower cost model, generally the innovations are going to be through cost of manufacture or formulation improvements. And as you heard Professor Hanschel talk, You also manage the competitive environment. Some of these can run afoul of the antitrust laws, which to a certain extent leads to the differentiated performance materials, where you now need to have a vertical company where R&D is much more important, and other functions that connect R&D become much more important than if you're just trying to reduce your costs through lower cost of manufacture and formulation. What this means is that R&D becomes a bit of a science. I apologize for the mashup here on translation of the chart. There are three things that you need in a materials company if you are going to use science as a business. The first of these is that you have to be very comfortable with the uncertainty associated with a large, balanced portfolio, balanced in terms of time, risk, and reward. And you have to be comfortable both emotionally and financially with the inevitable failures that are going to come about through that portfolio. The second is that you have to understand how to acquire and incorporate new knowledge as it comes in, whether it comes in from the inside through your research effort or from the outside. But in order to bring it in from the outside, you need to have a strong sensing function. Now, one of the questions that came up, I believe, from the gentleman at the back of the room on my left was, what do we give up? What are we losing? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but a lot of it's going to focus on this issue of sensing. And finally, you need to be able to do your development across all of your divisions. You have to be able to innovate between divisions, which is where the brilliance of innovation takes place, because intersections is where the unknowns are. And you have to be able to do it throughout your stages of development, whether it starts at research and works its way all the way through to commercialization and support. But the marketplace is a cruel place to live for materials. And what we find is that over some McKinsey work measuring the performance of the chemicals and materials industry from 2004 to 2014, what you see is that were it not for low-cost feedstocks, the industry would have essentially no margins. So commoditization is happening at an extraordinary rate. Margins get squeezed. Research stops being an investment on the balance sheet and starts looking like a cost on the balance sheet. The other thing that's happening at the same time is that the great innovations, where you're working in an area that's really new to you, these are happening at a very low probability of success. Again, another McKinsey study that showed success rates where you have low familiarity with the technology. The success rates are low. The times to delivery can be anywhere between 10 and 20 years. So these are happening simultaneously to the materials industry. Well, we live in a world where these large vertical corporations are owned by people who are different than those who manage them. And so the investors put a lot of pressure, and they do what is called focusing the industry. What that means is that they become less diversified, they're shorter term in their focus, and you shift your research and development to application development, which is incremental changes in existing materials. It's not really innovation any longer. And you can eliminate the functions that don't support that. So we don't need the front end anymore. In fact, in some cases, businesses have decided they don't need to manufacture any longer. And now you can see these three things that we said you need in order to have a success in commercializing science as a business. You've broken that chain. It's violated this. You've broken the connection from discovery to commercialization. You've broken the attractiveness of that enables you to bring new people in to your business, because now that front end doesn't exist anymore, a la what we heard about Park research. And you no longer can sense what's going on because it's your front end that senses the external environment. It's not the people at the plant. It's not people doing manufacturing improvements. So you begin to lose all of that. Well, we heard that one of the things that might happen is that venture capitalists might come in and help you out. Startups can help you out. In fact, that doesn't happen in the materials world. Remember the timelines. 10 to 20 years to commercialization from the time that you have an innovation. Well, that's not consistent with a venture capital model of 3 to 5 years to exit. And if you look at what's happened in the venture capital world, we now have the materials line with this little blip in the mid-2000s, and it's losing ground to investments in software and biotech. So that's not going to be your savior. Commercial companies do not want to invest millions of dollars and thousands of lives in an uncertain technology that they, in fact, did not invent themselves. And so there's nobody to fill the valley of death. You can see the same thing happening in publications and patents as these decisions are getting made in industry. And while, we get the whole thing about publications going down, patents are going down too in material science. Why is that? And I want to tip my hat to the Golden Goose Project here for these data. Why is that? Well, I've thought about that quite a lot, and I think the issue is that when you do application development, the concept of novelty is greatly reduced. And when novelty goes down, you can't get the patent. But even if you did get the patent, it would be something that could be relatively easily reverse engineered. So now I'm teaching somebody without protection. That's a waste of money. Why would I want to do that? So you also have some implications there on loss of competitiveness, loss of national security, because if you head to the right-hand side of this chart, for the first time in decades, almost half, if not more so, with contemporaneous data, of the top material science papers are not coming from the US any longer. So if I'm a scientist and I want to go work somewhere that's doing cutting-edge research, just like in the 1930s through the 50s, I'd go to Germany. Now, I'd go to Asia. Okay, so it's easy to look at this and say, oh my God, all is lost. We're doomed. Do you hear me? Doomed. But in fact, I want to give you a little bit of an uplift at the end here. Oh, sorry, I'm out of time. No, if we look at one really, really important industry, the photovoltaics industry, we've all heard that the panels are being made in China. It's so much cheaper to develop and manufacture panels in China than it is in the US. National Renewable Energy Lab did a brilliant study where they looked at why this was the case. And it's not what you hear about in the political dialogue of today. It's not low-cost labor. It's not about environmental regulations being weaker in China than they are here. All of that is true, but that's not where the money is. The money is in the innovation and the manufacturing ecosystem that gets built up around these panels. So how do you solve that problem? Well, what you do is you innovate. You invent a new technology. And an analysis that the same group at NREL did showed that if you do things that are not pie-in-the-sky stuff, really capable, not readily available, but not unimaginably difficult technology, and you build that same ecosystem within the US and take that same technology off to China and do the same thing there, what you find is you're within experimental error of being able to have these two technologies developed at the same cost, which can dramatically revitalize the US manufacturing in photovoltaics. Same thing applies to other industries. But we're not going to be doing this at the single firm level. This requires concerted governmental effort to make this happen, and I'd be more than happy to talk about the issues associated with that during Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. We will now be hearing from Jim McGroddy, who spent decades at IBM, currently a consultant, advisor to firms, universities of government, but notably, he was the senior vice president of IBM in charge of research from 1989 to 1995. And just to put that in context, that was a critical time in the history of IBM. They were on the ropes, and Jim played a critical role in trying to pull them off the ropes. So with that, please.
Thanks a lot. So I'm going to focus on a particular segment of industry, namely what people would call information technology and communications, which is broadly encompasses IBM and my experience outside IBM after I left and with the government and whatnot. And what I want to do is at least not propose there's no magic solution to this thing, but the one thing that is true today is if you drive up to the Watson Lab in Yorktown Heights, New York, and look, the parking lot is full. It's never been busier. And if you go inside, there's all kinds of interesting stuff going on, and a lot of it is good research, long-term research. So I wanted to focus a bit on a model that works. Lots of models apparently haven't worked, and after I left IBM, I was for short periods of time a consultant at a place known as Bell Labs and a place known as Xerox PARC and a place known as Kodak Research, who were on lists earlier today. Unfortunately, on the earlier slides, we didn't have IBM on that list, and that makes me feel good. I think a company, any company that wants to survive, and they don't all survive, witness Kodak, you got to live in the world as it is and the world as it's becoming and deal with those things and not pretend that, there was the good old days, and we heard, discussion about going way back and sometimes not so far back. Corporate research laboratories were like a monastery on a hill, and they were built and looked like that. And a lot of the people who worked there didn't have any connection to the company. Let me tell you something that happened when we were going through the crisis in IBM, and Lou Gerstner came from the cookie industry. And the first thing he did on the first day he was there, he had a meeting of the VP level people who remained, which was not all of them. And he gave us an assignment. He said, I want each of you guys to write a white paper, 12, 15 pages, because I don't know anything about this company. And he gave us the outline. You should talk about what business are you in, what are your products, who are your competitors, who are your customers, what's your economic model, what are your strengths and weaknesses, and that sort of thing. And I want you to send that to me over the next couple of weeks, and I'll come talk to you about that. And I actually had the paper already written because watching what was going on around me, it was clear either I was going to go or John Akers was going to go. And in either case, it's useful to have this paper. So I turned it in 2 days, and he came 2 weeks later. And the key thing he asked me after we did the introduction was, and I explained to him what we try to do in research, which was to deliver value to IBM in reasonably quantifiable terms that is 4 or 5 times the investment they put into the company each year, not 5 or 10 years out. And he said, how do you do that? Well, how do you figure out what to do? We spent the next couple of hours talking about that. And he changed his view at that point. He had been on the board of AT&T, and at the end of our day, he said, I want to thank you for not putting a problem on my plate here that he had seen at AT&T as a board member, namely that they have the smartest guys in the world, smartest people in the world, and they make very little difference to the business, to the customers, or to the bottom line. And he said, I want to thank you for not putting that problem on my plate here. And as I said, you can go there today, and there's a lot of activity. So the focus, if you looked at what we heard this morning, was a lot of discussion about the early days of research, and a lot of it is focused about delivering value to the corporation in a radically changing world, particularly in the world of IT and communications, where the technology has delivered an order of magnitude performance improvement every 5 years for over 50 years, 10 orders of magnitude. No industry has changed at that pace. People say, what about airplanes? The fastest jet airplane could fly 3,000 miles an hour. That's 3 orders of magnitude faster than you can walk. Small difference. So the fact that there has been change in, for example, the distribution of how you invest money and people's effort headed toward the future, no surprise if something is changing 10x every 5 years. And I would like to just sort of plow through these slides and point out that at least in IBM, and I think it's quite true today, there is real value in doing long-term research, even though you have to adapt how you do it and what you do. There are certain things that, as a country, we've gotten or let ourselves get squeezed out of. Look at this display here. That's half a single panel from a Generation 8 factory. This one was made with the earlier generation. See the black lines? That's 4 panels. Never been manufactured in the United States or, in fact, in Europe. We spent a fortune on R&D, DARPA funded particularly, years ago. I spent time here in Washington in the later 80s trying to convince the government to subsidize manufacturing. The chart that it was just up here on the difference in following through and capitalizing, capturing the value of the investment. We don't do that well in this country. Now, how do I move it ahead? There we go. So the world is totally different, and we focused on that and don't need to repeat any of that. We have fragmented value chains, whereas when I joined IBM a number of years ago, if you couldn't pull a single crystal of silicon, you couldn't be in the computer business. A very different world today. And speed has, the pace of everything has picked up. In terms of thinking about corporate investment, clearly you have to spend a lot of time thinking about the outputs, not the inputs. And if you're going to claim that you're going to be able to deliver value that's a multiple on a year-by-year basis of the investment, you got to sort of look at everything hard. I see what that is. That's how many minutes are left, because there's no clock here. And I mean, what we aimed at, and I think IBM Research still aims at, is IBM invests in IBM Research to win in the marketplace. I think it's that simple. So your agenda obviously changes, and the value that we delivered then, I think they still use a similar list. Hard to believe it's 20 years since I was there, more than 20 years now. We said there are 7 things we deliver value in, and you can quantify some of these. It says patents on here. My friend Marshall Phelps and I were very active in this in the late 1980s. IBM, having come from a